I think this conversation is perfect for RenCo. Like, as a community of generalists, I think there's probably nothing that screams generalist more than the chief of staff role, and particularly the career arc of the three panelists we have here. So really quick, we have Henry, who works at Embark, which works on self-driving trucks, then Christian at Astranis for internet satellites, and then Trevor from Lambda School, which is coding boot camps. So all three of these people, super generalists, started off with business backgrounds. We have Christian and Henry, ex-consultants, and then Trevor, who is doing accounting. And then each of them realized like that wasn't the game they wanted to play, and that set them off on this journey that's still playing out right now. And also along the way, each of them have had really interesting passion projects, which I found when I was Google stalking them all. So Henry has this robotics TED Talk with like 21,000 views, fun fact. And then Christian and Trevor both have founded companies, from a telecom roaming startup to a Spanish Bible app, and also write newsletters. So, and they're all thinking really deeply about what comes next. So that's a quick like overview of these three. And then I think what would make this a really fun conversation is if we can cover some basics about the chief of staff role and get some personal stories from them from the front lines, but then also get them talking to each other. So you guys definitely ask each other questions as well and follow up on things that are interesting. But I hope that everyone here chimes in really actively in chat and we can just make it more of a conversation. So I'll just start off with the most obvious, probably most asked question is, what even is a chief of staff? This catch-all, very mysterious role. And I'm gonna ask Christian first because he had a hot take that it's actually not so amorphous and mysterious as people make it out to be. So go for it. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. Hot take alert. Watch out, y'all. Yeah. No, I think that people believe the chief of staff to be a mysterious role because it's so closely tied to another mysterious role, which is the chief executive officer, a CEO. So oftentimes a chief of staff will be working directly with the CEO. I'm the chief of staff to the CEO, usually chief of staff to an executive. And people don't know what CEOs do. So I think that is kind of the root of a lot of the confusion. Like, people are just like, what are actually day-to-day does your CEO do at a company? Or even if you try to answer it generally, like, what does a CEO do? It's like, it doesn't really make sense. It's like kind of a crazy, it's like too general a question to answer. And that's how I think about chief of staff. Like, the chief of staff is the role, as I see it, is just to like level up the CEO in every way. So sometimes that will be by doing the things that they're not good at. Sometimes it'll be by helping them do more of the things they are good at. And it's really as broad as that. So everything that goes into a CEO role goes into a chief of staff role as well. Yeah. So it is very hard to pin down precisely. But in the same way that you can say CEOs are generally responsible for some things, they're responsible for leading the team, managing the executives, interfacing externally, all those sorts of things. You can say similar stuff about chiefs of staff. We do all those tasks and just whatever the CEO is not doing.
Yeah, totally. What do you think of that hot take, Trevor?
Excellent hot take. I think of it as giving leverage to the CEO. So the CEO has his or her laundry list of things to do. What are the things that that person would like to not have to do or dish off? The chief of staff is uniquely situated to take on those types of things. And then you can get into the details of like what that list is. But then that depends on kind of the CEO and the chief of staff, and that's kind of where you get into the details of like, oh, it's like so different. But I think at a very high level, it's giving leverage to the executive, and the kind of, you think of like what's the most idealized highest form of the chief of staff. I think of like the chief of staff to the president. Whereas like the chief of staff speaks, it is as if the president him or herself is speaking. And it's just another way to give leverage to the executive.
Yeah, and Henry, definitely add if you have anything to add to that, but I also want to piggyback off this really close relationship between this role and the CEO. And I think all three of you kind of know your CEO in different ways. And Henry, you mentioned that you've known the CEO you work with since you were both kids. So I just want to get you guys also talking about how that relationship started for you, what has been hard, like what's the process of really getting to know this person so deeply that you kind of have to be so in sync with and give leverage to. So Henry, go for it.
Yeah, so for context, I've known Alex, the CEO of Embark, since we were in elementary school and we were classmates at the time. We competed in robotics together in junior high, and then he went on and founded this company. So when I was first brought in, I was brought in as an intern and worked a bit for him. And I think through that experience, we got to know each other a bit better at a professional level. And I think there's a bit of a double-edged sword. Anytime you mix personal and professional relationships, there's a possibility that conflicts between the two will cross over into the other worlds. And so there is a bit of mental preparation needed. But I think for the chief of staff role, it's actually been a huge lever for us. One of the responsibilities in my mind for the chief of staff is that they are in a good position to give great feedback to the executive that they serve. And I think especially for the CEO, that is a role where it is very difficult to get candid feedback from your employees if you're in that role, just given the power dynamics that are at play. I think a chief of staff being accountable and meant to amplify the impact of the executive is in a position where it's part of my job to give the CEO feedback. But to the extent that I actually know the CEO quite well at a personal level, he sees me more as a peer as well, both personally and professionally. And I think that enables that relationship even more. And so I think in general, it's one of the roles where counterintuitively, it's probably good to have some degree of personal connectedness to the executive you're serving. And it's also one of the roles where, like, because of that, you do find a lot of chiefs of staff get into their roles through people networks because of this very dynamic.
Henry, what's the headcount of Embark?
Headcount of Embark today is about 110 people.
110. Yeah. I just think it's, I asked because, so Lambda School has about 170 people, and the job, just as the CEO role changes, the chief of staff's role changes a lot based on the size of the company. And Christian, Astranis is what, like 100-ish people?
Yeah, we're the same. We're like 100 people.
Okay, interesting. Henry, so I met Austin. So Austin's the CEO of Lambda School on Twitter, and I always felt bad telling people that I had like an in or something because it's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. But then you like knew this guy, he's the CEO since you were like in elementary school. So I feel significantly less bad about meeting Austin on Twitter. Christian, how did you meet, how did you know your CEO?
Yeah, John is the CEO of Astranis. I just joined as like a finance person. I don't know anything about finance, which is kind of remarkable that they like let me in, but they didn't ask any finance questions in the interview, so I got kind of lucky. And then once I was there, I just like expanded my responsibility, and sort of built up trust, I guess, from that. It ended up that like I was the third-ish business person at Astranis, so it was a relatively small business team, and like the CEO was the leader of the business team, really. And then I don't know, we just had a couple initiatives or whatever that crossed over, and I made it a deliberate point to try to build up credibility with the CEO and CTO of Astranis. Like I learned that they came in on Sundays, for instance, and just had a meeting together on Sundays, and I came up with a bunch of excuses for why I also had to be at the office on Sunday, like that kind of thing. So yeah, it was just a build up from within kind of thing, and I started taking on responsibilities that in retrospect are very chief of staffy. Like I was, whenever there was a project that didn't fit anywhere else in the company, I would be the person that went and chased it down. There were some culture things that I led. Like I did a bunch of surveys of the first 30 employees of the company and created this document that eventually became our values for Astranis. So I did a bunch of chief of staffy stuff before I was chief of staff. I think just because I was one of those first business people and, had a super broad domain of authority within Astranis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about you, Trevor, as someone who also started in a company in a different role and then you became the chief of staff? Like, what do you think it was about what you were doing that made you / the CEO realize that this would be a productive move?
So it definitely helped that I had a prior relationship with Austin. He, trusted me and like that. Yeah, that was already there. And then I joined Lambda as the first finance hire because not because I wanted the role, but because I wanted to be at Lambda School. And so there was always I was always looking for another thing to do. And so it just made sense when we raised the Series B that I'd kind of been in the, you know, the purview of like the detailed, like the fundraising, all the stuff related to the finances. And it was just kind of a natural transition for me.
Totally. I mean, like, there's definitely tiers of information, you know, like access. So people will have, like at Astranis, for instance, there's like initiatives that execs are read in on, or there's like, you know, some financial like fundraisers, like a great example. Like if you're read in on like when fundraisers are happening, like that is a thing that not everybody has at Astranis, like that kind of thing. And so I also trace the fact that I ended up building like credibility and trust in John to the fact that I was just involved in those finance discussions. Like that was definitely one of the first big things that was like a company-wide, like high trust needing issue that I was trying to solve.
Well, I want to get EJ up. She has a good question. You want to ask EJ? You there?
All right. Hey,
okay.
sorry.
Got you.
Yeah, this is super interesting topic. And I'd love to just hear, you know, what are some common pitfalls that chief of staffs often face? And if you have any, you know, relevant stories, please share.
I'll jump in with one potential pitfall, which is not clarifying your authority. So you get plucked up from the rest of the org and you're given this weird title, and people don't immediately know like what that means for them. So like if you say something, is the CEO saying that, or is it you saying it? And what and how much leeway do you have can you jump into any part of the org and run your thing or exert influence? And so being really clear, obviously first with the executive on kind of what your authority actually is, but then making sure to making it clear to people that your authority comes from you as much as it comes from the CEO, and earning that over time. You can't really, it is a fail case if you have to use the CEO's name. You have like, unless it's like Jen's laughing, but you know, rare instances only. And so anyways, all of that to say, there's just a lot of ambiguity in who you are and what you represent. And so clarifying that is super important.
Yeah.
I have a question for, oh, go ahead, Henry. Go for it.
Oh, sure thing. Yeah, I completely echo those thoughts. I think I had the same issues at Embark, where it wasn't completely clear where my scope of influence, responsibility began and ended. And we actually clarified it over a series of all hands, like what does Henry do? And like who does what in the G&A team? One other more macro, you could say pitfall, but I think it's just intrinsic to the job, is that because you're a generalist and not specialized, I think sometimes you get thrown into things that aren't necessarily like personal priorities from a career perspective, but you still have to do them as part of the job. And I think if you don't advocate for yourself well, that can very well snowball into you taking on functions that you don't see a long-term trajectory in. I think a case in point right now is that I'm running all of legal at Embark, which I think has been interesting to me, but there have been many conversations about like, when do I offload this to somebody who actually has a JD? Because I'm certainly not in a position to become general counsel anytime soon, and it's really not part of my roadmap either. So being able to set your own boundaries for what you can do will influence the arc of how you specialize and what type of role you come out at the other end. And I think that's something that this role in particular you need to be cognizant about, because there is no standard next step after the chief of staff role. There's no senior chief of staff. People typically will specialize into something that they've worked on during their tenure.
I'm curious for both of you guys, like how do you set like the stuff you're going to work on in any given week with your executive? Do you like have a meeting every Sunday or Monday that's like, here's the stuff I'm going to do? Like, did they bring you a list of stuff? Do you bring them a list of stuff? Just curious how that operationally works for y'all.
It's not the most interesting answer, but we have a Monday morning kind of calendar review. These are the meetings coming up for Austin. These are the preparations if needed, if any, for any of them. And then we're constantly, so a question that I like asking other chiefs of staff is like the communication tool of choice for the CEO. So Austin's is iMessage, like everything happens in text. And so we're constantly texting throughout the week as things change on the fly, but we have our weekly kind of, it's a one-on-one essentially to make sure we're on the same page. And I tend to come to him with what he wants, or not what he wants, what I think are the priorities, and then he'll provide feedback.
Yeah, pretty similar for me. We have regular syncs throughout the week. I think the one thing that has changed over time is that when I first joined the team, it was a bit more top down in terms of direction. At the time, Alex just had more context about the company and was able to clearly identify what the priorities were. But being in the role for a year and a half now, it's very much issues get bubbled up, and I set my own priorities and align them with Alex.
Yeah, interestingly, Trevor and Henry, you also have regular check-ins. We have no regular check-ins. And John's preferred communication tool is just phone. So he'll just kind of call me, and like sometimes I'll be in another meeting and I like have to decide like, do I leave this meeting or do I like ignore the CEO's phone call, which is like a strange choice to have to make. And he's getting better. I'll ping him and just say, hey man, like look at this look at the calendar. But it's a good, it works for him though. It's like his style of work. So you kind of have to adapt to that as a chief of staff.
So I think like the chief of staff role is clearly like a service oriented role. And so like when I think of Austin texting me or John calling you, Christian, it's like there's some like anxiety or like something like triggered that thing. And like my job in the future is to like eliminate that. And so I'm curious for either of you, like, how do you think about being proactive in addressing the sometimes extremely unarticulated needs of the executive? We're both smiling and it's true.
It's a great question that I like wish I knew the answer to, right? It's really hard. I mean, that is a really like it's an insightful question, because that's a huge part of the job, is like helping someone who doesn't have it all figured out themselves, like helping them figure it out. Like there's not a lot of people that a CEO can go to just like figure things out, like just work through a problem, to spitball, to like, like be vulnerable with, like to admit that they don't know something. Like there's a lot of things that are very hard for a CEO to do with just like a random engineer at the company or something like that. And that does end up being a huge part of my role, is just like working through things, like helping him figure out how we're going to handle XYZ issue that popped up this week, all that kind of stuff. And it's very closely tied to the like feedback point from earlier. Like it's very tough for execs to get feedback a lot of the time. It's also hard for them to just sort of have open, like loose discussions that they haven't actually like fully crystallized. And like, here is the strategy, here is what we're going to do.
Yeah, my I guess personal tactic for that is we have time in the calendar scheduled roughly on a monthly cadence where I give Alex feedback, but it's structured in many parts. So there's like feedback for him personally, and then there's my views on the company. And I think for him, that's been like a helpful way for us to have a structured approach to topics that don't get brought up in day-to-day operational discussions. But you're right. I think there's always a bit of guesswork that needs to be done. But as a chief of staff, I think you also have the ability to assert your opinion, and you should, given your closeness to the executive.
Yeah, I want to get Sarah up. She had a kind of related question. I'm hearing a lot of conversation about kind of like communication between either you and the CEO, or you and other members of the team, especially existing at this like 10,000 foot view. So Sarah, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question probably depends on the type of chief of staff and the size of the organization. But one thing I've heard from friends in the role is that sometimes there's pushback from different department heads or work stream leads because the chief of staff is sent to like fix a problem or to report for the CEO, and people sort of resent that. I'm curious if any of you have experienced that, and if you just worked really hard to befriend those people and earn their trust, or if you have any specific pointers.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the benefits of coming up from within the company, is that I already had existing relationships with most of the people that ran functions. But oh my gosh, it is like the most important part of my job, I think, to just kind of be there for other executives as well, to like make them feel like they can totally trust me, that they can like tell me things in confidence, that they can trust me to like float up the right things and not float up other stuff or whatever. Like just that interpersonal trust between execs is so important. And like the thing that is implicit in your question, which like deserves to be explicit, and like it is definitely the case, is that often comes into conflict with like being able to raise the right things to your CEO, or like making sure you act on something as fast as possible. Just like a super tactical example, if the VP of sales comes to you and says, hey, I have this piece of feedback, like I don't know if other people are feeling this thing about this process, but here's my piece. Like you can either decide to sit on that and just like kind of wait for other feedback or whatever, or you can flow it up to your CEO right away, or you can go do something about it. Like in any case, acting on the feedback often means kind of like, it's not, betraying is like the most aggressive word for it, but just like, dilute that word a lot. And that's what I mean. It like betrays their trust to just go do it right away if they wanted you to keep it in confidence, but then you can't actually do anything if you keep it totally in confidence. So that's kind of a constant struggle that I see in the role. And I don't have the answer. It's just kind of a case by case thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for a lot of those types of projects, I would still defer ownership to whoever the functional lead is for the particular problem in place. If it's an HR problem, like the HR manager should be the owner of that. And I think one of the things you get pretty good at in the chief of staff role is you are okay being invisible at times. There are a lot of things that I do on behalf of the CEO, like answering emails, writing all hands decks, writing weekly emails, but they get signed Alex Rodriguez. And like, I think part of the job requires some degree of humility and like understanding that like you are there to execute, but you are ultimately there to provide leverage for somebody else. And if you take that same mindset to the other functional owners that you work with, that like position yourself as a resource, but like don't come in with the mindset that you need to take the credit, that helps make the relationships a bit more frictionless.
Yeah, I actually was curious about this because the role is so often framed as a service role where, I mean, I think I read this article where it was like, don't take this unless you're in it to make everyone else's lives better at the expense of your own. So I would love to hear from you guys, like how you kind of have balanced like ego and personal growth being in this service role where your job is to make the CEO a superhero, and like all of you have very like intense personal projects of your own. Two of you are ex-founders of your own companies. How has that been in this role for you?
Yeah, I feel like, although it's true that I have no authority, I feel incredible ownership. So it is totally the case that Astranis feels like my startup, even though I am not in a position where I can go to an exec and be like, do this, do it now. Like, I think those two things are separate for me. So I don't know. I mean, it is definitely new and weird. Like the first time that you see an email go out that you wrote, but like it's not your name signed to the bottom, like totally Henry, but like can 1,000,000% empathize with that. It's really weird. And then there are other times when, there's something really like bad that could have happened that you help avoid or whatever. And you're never going to get credit for that. Like that's never going to be something, they're not going to write that down, and that's not going to go in the history books. But I don't know, that's the job. And I think that it's important to, at least for me, to be able to still feel like a true like owner of Astranis, even though I'm not like going to get a bunch of credit externally or going to, like sign the piece of paper that says, go do this thing. Like, here's the strategy.
Yeah, it feels even worse when you send an email and then you see all the replies from staff members about how awesome the vision for the company is. You're like, oh, it's so great. And the way I kind of think about it is it's so like one of my love languages is like appreciation or whatever. I forget what the phrase is, but I like being told, oh, hey, that was a good thing. And I think it's just like it's just the price of doing the role. And like the upside is all of these, the upside is I get to see as much as the CEO and learn as much of the CEO without the responsibility of the CEO, or the responsibility of founding the company from scratch. And so it's, I don't know, I feel like it's actually a super easy trade-off, because there's all these other huge benefits that come with it. And if the great job email doesn't go to me, it goes to the CEO, it's like, whatever, no big deal.
Yeah. And I think also like there is one person who has visibility, and that's the CEO or the exec you work with. And so having a strong relationship there is helpful. And if they are somebody who can provide good feedback, I think that's a great person to have, who's able to knock their fist on the table for you for. The other thing, though, I think it's also important to know what your objectives are in the role. I think for me, the main objective was like I wanted to learn how to build a business. And so in that sense, having credit for what I do or not wasn't really a high priority. It was just about like seeing how it's done and then being entrusted to actually do it myself. And so going in with that mindset, it wasn't a huge problem with me.
Yeah, I love all of those answers. I also want to tag Matt up, who asked tons of amazing questions in Slack before this event even started. So thank you. But do you want to jump in and kind of ask about the CEO dynamic you were talking about?
Yeah, and thanks. When you guys mentioned CEOs just kind of throwing vague requests or ideas at you and kind of you being asked to run with it as a trusted conduit or a trusted agent and just kind of a communications broker, I wonder if there's ever a case where you can do your jobs too well and they start to go to you for things that they maybe should communicate effectively and clearly with the rest of the executive team, if you can almost create too much of a dependency there.
That would be an amazing problem to have. One of my regrets, or I wouldn't say a regret, but like something that I've learned is I wish I had taken on even more than I had in the role, because there's so much for the CEO to do that if you can do it successfully, at least in Austin's case, he was like more than happy to hand it off. So and this, I think this translates to startups in general. It's like, if you're doing a thing successfully, everyone is like, yes, like do more. So that hasn't been as much of a concern for me, Matt.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I'm curious for you guys have been sort of like the lowest points or most difficult moments, either in the past or something that you're struggling with right now, to what extent you can actually talk about it.
So I mentioned this to, I think, Trevor and Mishti before this, but one of the hardest parts of the role for sure is how confidential a lot of the stuff you do is. There's just so much that's going on that like it is my job to hold hold those secrets myself or whatever, or to take on burdens for other people on the team that they will never know about, or things like that. And that definitely extends externally as well. Like, it is so hard to know for me, and like I actually would love to hear from you, Henry and Trevor, like how you think about this, but there are like lots of problems that Astranis is facing or whatever, or like issues that I have to deal with that are like in my job jar that I don't know who to ask about. I don't know if it's okay to ask people about things, or like, can you go and like disclose that stuff to other people? So far, I've just basically like not at all. Like I've like just ignored the problem to the point of like just taking on that additional burden and not having a place to like ask for outside help. So I wonder if y'all have thought about that, like how to balance the confidentiality of the role with wanting to get external input.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer. I sympathize though with like, especially I think for all of us having been at the company and having friends at the company, and being able, like, you can't share whatever thing with like the circle is smaller. It's not the best. And you mentioned something earlier, Christian, which is like, or maybe it was Henry, I'm sorry. Like you have this info that would be useful to X people, but you're like, is it shareable? Like, what's the dynamic there? And it's not always clear. And so at least for me, I tend to default to like not sharing, because the downside of sharing something that's unshareable is quite bad. And so I don't know. having the relationship with Austin, it's you kind of go back. I could kind of go back to him and we text and talk, and if he has worries, like I know when he's worried by different things that he does, and there's, I guess it's, for me at least, I kind of point it back up.
Yeah, pretty in agreement there. I think one of the low points for me was one of the engineers at some point came up and was like, "Oh, I don't know what you do. Are you like some glorified executive assistant?" And I think it's like important, therefore, to like define your role with the company and tell people what you are doing, because they will just assume that you're doing nothing if what you're doing isn't like cleared to them. And there's multiple parts of that. Like A, you have pretty low visibility in some of the things you do. B, as Christian mentioned, there's a lot of stuff you do that is confidential that can't be shared with other people. And so I think, therefore, it's important to tighten up the language around like what you are actually doing, because it's a fairly foreign role to a lot of employees, I think, especially technical employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a point. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna, it's quick. I was just gonna say, when I was still on the operations team, but I was like stepping into more chief of staffy stuff, we have like a public place where we post our like weekend updates or like weekly updates for the ops team. And it got to the point where I just had nothing to write down anymore. So everybody thought I just like didn't do anything at the company. I was like, I promise I actually am doing work. I just like can't write it down publicly. But of course you can't even say that, or like that gives up the secret too. So people just assumed I did nothing.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah had a funny comment in chat. She was like, I read that as being low-key being a mind reader. Do you want to unmute and ask your question, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that I've read about the role involve it being you're standing in for your executive or your leader a lot of the time in a meeting or for a project. So I'm just curious when you were able to be a Jedi mind reader, and maybe when you weren't able to do that.
And kind of jumping off of that, also, like, what makes you able or not able to do that? How do you prepare when you're going into an important meeting where you have to really be in sync with what someone would be thinking?
It's easier with the things that the CEO, that Austin, cares about, because those things you like talk about a lot. It ends up being a lot harder when it's these areas that he's not as interested in, because he just it hasn't come up in conversation. And yeah, so it's, I don't know, it's a matter of talking to the CEO. It comes back to the cadence, and for us, like mapping his meetings and my meetings for the week. And then like, if there's a question, at least in my case, actually, sometimes I can just text Austin because that's how he likes to communicate. But it's about being proactive for the meetings that are coming up for us.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just an exposure thing. It's just like, I've gotten better at it over time because I like, as Trevor said, we've just talked about more stuff, and I like know how his brain will react to things. And like even new situations now, like I kind of have downloaded a lot of his frameworks for viewing the world. And I for sure engage in a lot of like amateur psychoanalysis of like, like, where did this come from? Like, what's like the reason behind this? And like, what's the generalizable reason, like why he would feel this way about this problem? Like, I think about that all the time, just constantly, because you have to really download their brain into your brain. And to me, that's like a very, intellectual exercise. Maybe for other people, they would just do it intuitively, but for me, it's very like, I have to think about it a lot.
Yeah. Sorry, Trevor, do you want to?
I was gonna ask another question, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask Mick to jump in if you have any thoughts. Like, I know you've been with a company as it scaled crazily, Jen was saying, probably also thought a lot about your relationship with the CEO and kind of low moments in the job and how you got through them. So you want to
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of this resonates pretty deeply with me. I think especially sort of the description of the role of there being a lot of intimacy in the role between the chief of staff and the executive that they support, and being able to play an important role that is a little bit obscured from the broader view of the company is interesting. I was thinking in terms of I'd be interested to hear about some of the frustrations that panelists have. Like one of the things that got me in the role that I was just thinking about because of some of the discussion earlier is, you spend a lot of time, or at least in my case, you spend a lot of time sort of trying to compensate for the areas where the CEO is sort of, where it's not in their best interest to be spending their time, or alternatively, where they just don't want to be spending their time. And so then you end up needing to like push them in these areas where they just do not, like where it's like sort of drawing blood from a stone. I'm curious if that resonates with the panelists, and more broadly, kind of like what are some of the like elements of the role that they find more, you know, frustrating on a week-to-week basis.
I mean, I feel like the answer is kind of implied in your question, which is like, there's just like these list of things that the CEO needs to do. It's like, only you can do it, dude. And I, you know, I can put it on your to-do list. I can text it to you. I can snooze your own email and have it pop up when I know you're going to be in your inbox. And then there's just some things where it's like, yeah, it's just hard. And, you know, working with his EA to, is there another way we can do this? So one of the things so Austin, if you're on Twitter at all, you might have seen Austin on Twitter. He's incredible at Twitter. He's an amazing communicator online. He doesn't enjoy as much doing like slide decks. And so, you know, I know a lot about his vision. I know a lot of the stuff, but ultimately if like he's given a pitch or whatever, he needs to like kind of review it and give his input. And that can be hard to do sometimes. So one of the things, this is kind of maybe really tactical in the weeds, but one of the things, and some people might laugh, but it's just, you got to work around the CEO to build a draft of a deck I was doing. I was like, hey, do this, give me a draft as if you were tweeting the headlines for each slide. And so he did a tweet storm, and it was good. It was awesome. And I was able to use that to like build a draft of this deck and then come back to him and be like, hey, we can like iterate on this now. And so just working around whatever the CEO's thing is, I think is, and being creative about that can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, 100%. It is like a, it's so funny. It's just like the only you can do this, dude. Like I've thought and or said that often. It's like, but I mean, at the same time, I think it's a very strange, like the chief of staff role is like sort of a weird role in that it is less about your personality traits than somebody else's personality traits. And that's like almost never true for any other role, as far as I know. Like having to tailor your style of communication, of working, of, you know, checking in, to-do list, just like any part of the work experience, to have that be optimized not for how your brain works, but for how someone else's brain works. That is like a really weird mindset shift that you have to overcome in kind of the early weeks or months of chief of staffness. And yeah, that totally, like the get him to tweet it is a brilliant strategy, because that like shows Trevor's understanding of Austin's brain and like how he is the best. And for me, like for John is really good at just extemporaneously speaking. Like his thing is, and that's why he loves talking on the phone, right? He's at his best when he is, you know, coming up with answers to questions or just verbalizing something. So if I need to get a slide deck out of him, probably the best way for me to do it is just to like say, okay, John, just start talking, like just go for it. And so maybe there's some insights you can pull out for other jobs too from that, of like how to work with executives. It's like less about you and more about them. But yeah, that 100% resonates with me.
Yeah, Trevor, you want to jump in? You had a question before.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So we were talking earlier about, you know, there's these, you know, with the information and the relationship that the chiefs of staff have, there's, you know, sometimes the downside to a misstep can feel significant sometimes. And so my question for either of you is, has there been a time where, and the reason so before I even ask the question, if we can get better about identifying like the actual downside of something like this, then it gives you a lot more leeway to be more open, which can be super powerful. And so has there been a time where either of you has like shared something or done something where the CEO made a point like, oh, that maybe wasn't the best idea, or let's do something differently sometime? And then we could talk about like, oh, like how big of a deal was it actually versus maybe what like your expectations might have been. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's been something like a constant thing. Well, in the beginning of when I was chief of staff, it was a thing for me. And now I've sort of gotten used to receiving negative feedback from the CEO, or like constructive feedback or whatever, not negative. I've gotten used to getting like feedback from the CEO. But that's not something that everybody else is used to at a company. So I've had to do a lot of coaching of like helping other people realize that like, if John has feedback for you, it's okay. Like, it's not like he dislikes you. It's not like he like thinks you're dumb. Like, that's not it at all. It's just that he has feedback, and like coming from his role, coming from like his style of leadership, whatever it might be, it can seem more intense than it really is. And so, yeah, in the early days of working with John, it definitely felt like that for me. And now it has transitioned to me helping other people, respond to his feedback positively and not like worry about it so much.
Another framework I use to think about this is when Alex and I talk about different tasks and which ones I should do, we always think about like who is more likely to do a better job. Not in the context of like if we both had infinite time, who could do better, but like Alex being CEO might get to this thing 2 weeks out in the future and only spend 2 hours on it, versus I could do it tomorrow and spend half my day on it. And so even though like these are important things with a high cost of failure, there are times where like the chief of staff in their position probably is in a better spot to accomplish certain roles, and that's overall better for the company. And so I think like I always try to zoom it up into like the philosophy behind why I'm there, and then I think it seems less bad that I might screw up something when like had the CEO been responsible for all of these things, it's likely a lot of them would have been dropped.
Yeah, I wanna take the philosophy behind why you each are there like to a more meta level. So how, and Jen asked this question before, but how do you see this fitting into your trajectory right now? How you're thinking about next steps? Like what really matters to you when you're thinking about what you want to accomplish in your career, and how do you think about this as a part of that? And also Mick, to jump in if you want on this one.
Yeah, I can start here. I think one of the things I'm toying with is like the thought of starting something myself in the future, and I do think that this role is a fairly good precursor for that, because it teaches you how to build a business. In my mind, there's like two things I need to be able to do. One is build a product, and the other is build a business. I came into this role with like neither of those skill sets, and now I'm like building the toolkit for building a business. There's perhaps a future world where I explore the product side of things, but I see it as being like overall great education for myself and fitting that narrative too. Although I would also note that like I would never really plan ahead any more than a year. My interests have like frequently shifted, and so this particular role for me seemed like the best direction to go at the time that I made the decision, in terms of like being in a cool industry and being a role that had good exposure across the company. And those are some of the factors going in. I think now that I have this founder itch, the justification has changed a bit.
Makes sense. Mick, were you going to say something as well?
Yeah, I think that I'm a bit of an anomaly when it comes to career trajectory, like and sort of looking at that through the chief of staff role. I sort of fell into it. Like as Jen mentioned at the start, I met Tim in Australia playing poker when he was just thinking about the idea of Zoox. I wasn't really connected to the tech world at all. And then the sort of experience became such a roller coaster, and it was so exciting to be a part of that it just felt like, the best possible career opportunity that I could have had. And I wasn't necessarily as strategic or tactical about figuring out where it could be. From my perspective, I was like, in the room where the decisions were being made about a company that was at that point like a total rocket ship. But I do regret that. And it's sort of, to bring it back to something that was said earlier as well, I can't remember who, but someone was saying like the more that they could personally take on, the better as far as they're concerned. And on one level, I understand that, but that is exactly the approach that I adopted because in the early stages, I sort of really was just looking for any way that I could contribute, and that was the mindset I had. And I ended up, as the company scaled, spread so thin that I think that I was still contributing at a high level, but I hadn't kind of carved out a niche for myself. And yeah, I just think that like if I had my time over, one of the things that I would have done is to be much more mindful about that, because as a company scales, like it's very easy, I think, especially in that type of role where you don't have support, to get lost in the mix.
Yeah, totally. Trevor, do you have thoughts on that? I feel like you mentioned kind of the breadth versus depth angle of thinking as you think about your next steps earlier as well.
I mean, my answer is fairly similar to Henry, which is, so I did a bootstrap company that did pretty well, but I'd like to do something venture backed eventually. And so I wanted to learn like the operations of a venture backed fast growing company without necessarily, the downside, quote unquote, downside of being the founder or the CEO and the different responsibilities that come with that. So I feel like if I were to get to that stage, I would be doing it for the 1.5 or 1.75 time, not the first time, like kind of Austin is going through himself right now. So yeah, that's there's that, and then just generally, the chief of staff role has so much optionality built into it. That's not maybe in and of itself a good reason to take the job, but you can definitely take it without a very kind of concrete idea of what your next step will be, because once you've done the role for 18, 24 months, the business is as good as anybody else, and you have a ton of trust in the org, and you can basically write your own ticket for if you stay internally at the company for what you want to do next.
Yeah, so when I came into the chief of staff role, I wanted to be a founder someday, or like I still may, but like basically I came into it thinking this is CEO school. Like this is a front row seat to see what being a chief executive officer to like a fast growing company looks like, and to learn all those skills. And it has definitely lived up to that for sure. Just you get a sense and feel the responsibility, the like breadth of problems that you have to be able to solve. You get that ownership, like I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of that does come with the role for sure. I actually think that since I've been chief of staff, though, I have wanted to be the founder of a venture-backed company less. Learning what it is like firsthand, it is so hard. It is ridiculously hard to be a founder of a venture-backed company. Like the amount of impact it has on your life, the amount of impact it has on just like basically it's 7 or 10 years or something where that is all you do. Like that is your life, is doing that thing. So for me, I think that what is important to me in a role, I've actually learned quite a bit about that as I've been chief of staff. And I think it just comes down to a couple of things for me. It's believing that what I'm doing is important. Like if the end output of what I am achieving in the role is something that the world needs or should or like would benefit from, that's number one. Number two is if I feel like I personally am helping that come to fruition. Like when I was in consulting, like the reason I really didn't love it that much is because Deloitte didn't care about me at all. Like if I just left the company, they would be exactly as well off, basically. Like maybe 1 out of 300,000. Like that's how much it would like. There's 300,000 employees at Deloitte. Like it would not have been that huge of an impact if I left. Compare that to Astranis. Like I feel like I really have like a big role in like helping this company achieve the ultimate end goal that it is trying to achieve, and like that's what I want ultimately. So if I can get that benefit, and if I can still feel like I'm helping achieve some like greater aim, then like to what Trevor called earlier, the costs, like there are definite costs to being a founder and to being the like ultimate person that is responsible for the company. And so I don't know, like I actually haven't fully decided if I want to do that yet, after having seen it really close up. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually. And I wonder for the like Henry and Trevor and Mick even, or anyone else who wants to chime in, what about getting this really honed in view on what it is to be a founder has made you want to do it more versus Christian was saying it's actually maybe made you want to do it less? Like what aspects seem more attractive now?
I mean,
I'll happily, sorry, you go.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I would co-sign what Christian said, absolutely. And for me, it's not just like the amount of extra respect I have for the CEO role is astronomical. And when I hear people talk about how CEOs just get everyone else to do the job and so on, I just scoff these days, because it's not just the amount of engagement and work, it's also the weight of the decisions that are made every day. Like literally every tricky decision reaches you for resolution. And yeah, like I never really had ambitions to go down that founder path myself, but I definitely would just co-sign that the one benefit from being in that role for me is to really give me respect for just how significant it is to be the CEO and to have that level of responsibility on your shoulders.
Yeah, I think I look at the exact same set of facts and like arrive at the opposite conclusion, which is like, I think the ownership is like what excites me. That's like similar to Christian, like part of the reason why I left consulting was because like I was there, but I was advising somebody else who was ultimately making the decision, and like my immediate impact wasn't super obvious to me. I think chief of staff is getting closer to that model of ownership, because you are influencing a very key executive in the company, helping them make decisions and probably making some of your own. But I'm actually excited by the responsibility, and the founder, the CEO does make a lot of those types of decisions. And I think that's become very clear to me and has pushed me more towards thinking that is a viable path.
Plus one to Henry, and like, yeah, Austin deals with a lot of crap, but like if you follow him on Twitter, you might have seen some of our student stories and how people's lives are super impacted. And it's not like Austin's patting himself on the back, like, oh, I did this, but like the sense of kind of purpose and like, intensity of positive life that like comes with that, I think is profound and interesting. Definitely has all of the costs that have been mentioned, but to me is, if one is even lucky to get to the level that our CEOs have gotten to, is super fascinating, something that has become more interesting to me because of the role.
Yeah, and what's something that if you guys do end up founding a company or whatever you end up doing next, like what do you think something is that you will take from this experience in terms of how to work with people, different kinds of people, or how to be a better member of a team?
Yeah, I've definitely learned a ton about my personal style and like the strengths and weaknesses that come along with it. So I'm like a nice, wholesome Midwesterner at heart. Like I want everyone to be nice. I like don't want to be mean ever. I just like, I want to be friends with everybody. Like, I don't know, that's my core style. Like I'm smiley and I'm happy and I like want everyone to have fun. That's really good in some ways. Like there are definitely ways to use that or whatever, for that to be a very productive way of working. But there are also shortcomings. Like it is hard for me when my normal style is like everyone's friends, to give tough feedback. I've had to learn how to do that. So I don't know. I think that like the reason why the chief of staff role has helped me so much with that is probably because of what I was talking about earlier, where you really have to embody like a different style of leadership than your own, or like a different mind than your own as you go through this role. And that's taught me like, oh, this other way of looking at the world is really useful for solving this, that, and the other problem. And then its shortcomings are over here. And then I can sort of also rationally assess my brain and my way of looking at things, which works a lot in some cases, like being happy-go-lucky, like really builds a lot of camaraderie, like people are on your team, people like want to have the fun that you're having, like those are all really good things. but it can be harder to be an authority figure or to like, inspire confidence in the same way that like a more kind of directive person would be. So I've just learned a ton by like trying on different leadership hats, which is a useful and like unique thing that comes along with chief of staff.
Yeah, I'd say for people kind of thinking about the role and maybe whether it's a good fit for them, I think kind of depending where you are in your career and the kind of level of the chief of staff role you would be considering, it can be a really good way to figure out your style and what you like doing in a company, because you get to see and be a part of so many different things. And maybe that's for people that are kind of earlier in their career, but you just get exposed to so much that you're inevitably going to be drawn to certain things over others, and can be really helpful kind of sussing that out.
Yeah, for sure. Henry or Mick, do you want to add anything? I'll wrap after this one.
Sure, yeah. And similar to what Christian said, I think it's a very good exercise in empathy. And that's probably the key people skill I've taken away. Empathy is about like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I think you quite literally do that in this role. Like you have to act as the CEO. You need to write emails on their behalf and sign it as them. And so you really have to like put on somebody else's hat. And I think that would be quite valuable for any other future role where you're working with other people, where you're doing customer discovery, whatever it is. Being able to quickly zoom into what drives somebody else, I think is a very valuable mindset that I've developed in this role.
Totally. Okay, well, with that, I will wrap this. It's been really, really awesome to just get you all talking to each other. I think I've learned a lot, just the humility and open-mindedness that you all described bringing to your roles and sort of figuring out how to work with one person very closely, but also lots of people across your teams, I think is super valuable to like any generalist who is thinking about their career in the startup world, especially. So thank you so much. And if people want to follow up with you, is there a way they can contact you, DM on Twitter or email? Do you want to just post something in chat if you're open to that?
Yeah, sure. People can email me, call me, tweet me when you want to reach me.
Sweet. Okay, well, thank you all so much and see you at the next RenCo event.
Thank you, Mishti, for moderating too. And thank you, Christian, Trevor, Henry, Mick. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.